Amen. So we've transitioned to the gospel according to Mark. This is our first week in Mark, right? We had the Kings last week. So we're moving on to the New Testament. Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.'" Then he called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All of these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." And this is the good news for God's people. I went to see my grandpa this weekend, and yesterday on my way back home, I was traveling on Highway 60, the preferred route, and if you've been out there east of town, there's this little section where they're doing some road construction. It's down to one lane, and they've got a stoplight on each end, and you have to stop and wait your turn and go along. So as I was coming, there was nobody in front of me, and right as I got close to the light, it turned red. So I come up to a stop, and nothing's coming. But eventually, this truck pulls out. It took him a while to get going. It was a big semi-truck. And so he is coming down. There were no workers on that day, so apparently it was, go as fast as you want day in the work zone. And that truck came and was like, he's going really fast. And if I didn't know that he was going to, swerve over and take the open lane whenever it gets there, I would be a little bit nervous right now. I might have been a little bit nervous anyway. But he came on, he kept getting faster and faster and faster. And he comes around, whips around, and the trailer is kind of leaning over, and as he passes by, it's like the ground was shaking, and I could just feel it. It's like, oh my gosh. No, there's nobody behind him. He was the only one on the road. And just as this other car pulls out into the lane, which I thought, man, that's kind of a long time, the light turns green. But they had just started on that one-lane stretch, and so I decided I better wait. I don't want to, have a little bump down at the middle of the road. So I wait, and this person was in no hurry at all, unlike the truck. And so they just kept going and poking along. And so I'm waiting, and it's like, I'm going to miss my light. And so I'm waiting, and my light is still green. And just as they're almost there, it's almost like they were slowing down as they were getting closer. And so I made the choice not to wave at them, but I did want them to let them know that, I do have the right of way here. So I started to sort of creep forward just a little bit to let them know, I'm waiting on you. And right as they transitioned over into the other lane and I could go, and the light turned red. So I missed it. And so I was like, well, what do I do? Do I just go ahead and push through? And I knew that somebody else would probably be in the same situation as me on the other side, so I just stopped and I waited. And I had pulled forward far enough that the light was out of my field of view, so I was doing this, looking out my window, trying to see that the light was ever going to turn green. Took forever. Fortunately, the people behind me were very patient. They saw it all happen just like I did, and we all had to wait together. Now, every once in a while, I decide that the light doesn't really pertain to me, and I will do what I want. So we've got a picture here. And this is the light that I go through most often, but not the traffic light, the walk light on the side. So oftentimes during the mornings, I'll take a walk down to the end of Highland. No, it's not Highland, Hillcrest. So I'll walk through the botanical garden and walk down to the end of Hillcrest. There's this nice little field out there, and it changes every time I'm down there, so it's an interesting experience. And then I'll come back. But I jaywalk sometimes, and I will also cross not paying attention to whether it says walk or don't walk. And most of the time I do that, one, because I cross in the middle of the street up the street so I can keep in the shade, because on this side of the street I've got shade here and then further, and there's no sidewalk or crosswalk, so I just go ahead and I'll walk across if there's no traffic coming. I don't make anybody slow down for me or have any close calls. But then if it's like this, and we've got traffic in the middle of the road, then I'll probably push that little button, wait for the light to change, and everybody stops, and then I'll go across. But most of the time, there's not a lot of traffic, and so I really don't feel too bad about crossing the street when there's nobody that's I'm gonna get in their way. And really, I feel better about not pushing the button because I know that the people who are coming along aren't gonna have to stop for a red light and wait just because it took me 10 seconds to walk across the street, but the light's gonna be red for 30 or 40. But there are times in which I do sort of obey what's going on there, and that's when this car is driving by. That's the Ponca City Police. And I figure if I get in trouble someday for crossing the street without waiting for the walk sign or not gonna, then I'll plead my case, and if they agree with my logic, then fine. If they don't, I'll end up paying a fine, and that's the way it works, right? I'll go with the consequences. And so what I'm dealing here with is a couple of options of how we look at our ethics. Do we follow the rules, no matter what the rules say, that's what you do? Or do we take the context in which we're living and decide, I'm going to see what the consequence is and make my decision based on that, regardless of what the rules are? So if you're a rule follower, if you're somebody that says, well, it doesn't matter if I go ahead and cross the street, when it's convenient, I need to wait for the light. If it's white and says walk, then I go. If it's red and says don't walk, I don't. If that's the person you are, then you are a deontologist. That's where the rules matter. We follow the rules. We've all decided what the rules are. We're going to follow them. They're there for a reason. Keep society orderly. But if you're kind of like, well, it really depends on what the end result is going to be, more than it depends on the rule, then you'd be a teleologist. And so we've got deontology and teleology in this understanding of ethics. And I have to admit, I really do fall more in that teleological realm in which I kind of look at the situation and I look at what the end result is going to be, and I make a judgment call on that. And sometimes I walk against the light. But most of the time, because let's admit, most of the time the rules are there for a reason, and it makes sense to follow them. Sometimes people are real sticklers for the rules. The Pharisees were sticklers for the rules. They were experts in the law. They knew the law of Moses forward and backward, and they knew the tradition of the prophets very well. They were very great academic people that really studied everything, and they knew what the appropriate rule was and the course of action was for every context. And they sit here and they see Jesus there with his disciples, and they're eating, and they're like, defiled hands, come on, you got to wash those things. Don't you know the rules? We've got the rules for a reason. And Jesus gets into a little bit of a conversation about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. Now, the Pharisees, they really are, they're not the ruling class by any means. They're not the ones in charge of everything, but they are educated. They are people of note. And when you compare that to the disciples, who are they? They're fishermen. They were tax collectors. Tax collectors, nobody liked the tax collectors. They were taking money for the Romans and the occupiers of the land. And so they saw the disciples as kind of dirty people, unclean people. And whether that be like physically or ritually, which really they were more concerned with the ritual aspect of it than probably the physical aspect of it. And that's what Jesus is kind of getting at. It's like, well, where are your priorities? Where are your priorities? And so the Pharisees feel as though if you do something that is offensive to God, which eating with unclean hands would be offensive to God, then God will turn away from you. And it wasn't just that person, it was the community. Remember, they have a much more communal identity. We kind of think of ourselves oftentimes as individual people of faith, and we come together as a community and worship together, and we do things as church, but we kind of oftentimes see our actions and our consequences of our actions as being very individualistic. They were much more community-minded. And so they felt as though if any of the people in the community were eating with defiled hands, it's just as well that everybody in the community eats with defiled hands, because God would react to them as a whole. And so if the disciples are eating with defiled hands, everybody there is going to experience the break in relationship with the divine. And so that is their concern. I find this interesting that, we kind of have this back and forth with the what's clean, what's not clean. And when we read these scriptures, we kind of have this impression that everybody's following these laws of holiness code, right? The holiness code, the cleanliness laws. We just assume that that's the kind of the way that everybody is living, and that these disciples would have been the exception. But really, I don't know that that's the case. We have to remember that around the Sea of Galilee, there weren't a lot of Jewish people. There weren't no Jewish people, but it wasn't all Jewish people. Around a third of the people there were Jewish people. There were all the people that used to live there before the Israelites came along, and so they're still around with their traditions, and they're occupied by Rome. Remember this. They've been living in this, what we call a Hellenized society. The Romans looked to the Greeks for their inspiration of their philosophy, of their way of life, and so they really were more in line in their day-to-day lives with living like a person from the Roman Empire than they were identifying as people living according to the Jewish tradition. Now, there was probably some mix of each of those, and it's hard for us to really say one way or another what anybody was doing, but it's fairly likely, not certain, but fairly likely that Jesus and his disciples had short hair and clean-shaven faces, which is really outside of our romanticized image of all of them according to those Renaissance paintings that we've all been experiencing from our upbringing that really were the idealized image from the European perspective. I think in our scripture today, you can't see it, but this part where it says, they were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. And then they've got this little parentheses. For the Pharisees and the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. Why would Mark put that in there? Doesn't everybody know this already? Actually, Mark is in a town southwest of the city of Rome when he's writing this, and he's understood to be a student of Peter. So he wasn't in that original group of disciples that was going around, but Peter's in this community southwest of Rome, and Mark is observing and hearing the stories that Peter is teaching about the ministry of Jesus. And so Mark is writing to a group of Gentiles, and he's explaining that Jewish tradition as best he can, and he gets some of the details wrong, but he does the best he can to explain the tradition of the Jews so that the people who are reading this text might understand exactly why the Pharisees would care if they had washed their hands or not. And so we have this sort of removed understanding of the ministry of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark and more importantly, the tradition of the Jewish people. In the early church, there was the trend for people outside of the Jewish faith to hear the stories of Jesus, to hear this amazing teacher, to hear this healer who was offering something new. And they called it the way. And so we had all these people who weren't familiar with the Jewish tradition, but wanted to know about Jesus, the Christ, the one, the anointed one, the Messiah. And so in that early church, the leaders that were from that Jewish tradition had to make a decision. Well, we've got all these people coming in from the outside. Do we allow them to come and participate in this new way? Or do we make them sort of go back and become Jewish first so that they might more fully embrace the gospel message? Do they have to adhere to these holiness codes that we have, these cleanliness laws? Do they have to avoid eating the foods that we avoid eating? Where do we land on this? And so Peter, the person who was Mark's teacher, if you recall in the book of Acts, has the dream. He's in his time of meditation and prayer, and so he has this experience where he's up on the rooftop and he has this vision of a sheet coming down and it's filled with food, and he hears the words, "Eat." But these foods are not foods that are allowed. They're unclean foods. He says, "Never. I would not eat that profane food." And God responds, "Do not call profane what I have made clean. Eat." So this happens a couple of times. There's repetition in this. It has to be duplicated to sink in for Peter. And he recognizes that it's okay for people to let go of some of that old tradition as we enter into this new tradition. And so that Mark is writing this piece for the Gentiles to let them know that you don't have to worry about whether or not your hands are clean ritualistically in order to participate in our group. Jesus is more concerned about how you're living and what you're producing in your actions than these rituals of the past. Now, well after Jesus' time, about 40 years after the resurrection, the Romans destroyed the city of Jerusalem, and they destroyed the temple, and they killed all the priests, and they destroyed the hierarchy of the church. The priests were the ones who used to tell people what was and was not okay when it came to what's clean and unclean. The priests were the ones who kept everybody on track with these rules and regulations. And so in that vacuum of authority, the Pharisees were kind of the next in line for knowing what was right and what was not right for the people. And we'll find a lot of mention of the Pharisees, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. But Mark has a little bit about the Pharisees as well. And so they are that main remnant of the tradition, and they're a competition for this new way. This way of Jesus in which we have a new understanding of what it is to be people of faith, to be people who are holy. And so how do they know what's right and what's wrong? Jesus says, you know what's right and what's wrong based on your actions. what comes out of your heart, not what is going into your mouth. It is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. Not from without, but from within. Fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. These are the roots of actions that are not pleasing in the sight of God. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. I had to look up a couple of those words. They're not common in my everyday usage. But they're all similar in that they predominantly come out of selfish emotion. They're ways in which we try and fulfill needs in our lives where we have emptiness. We may have some injury in the past. We may have some perceived inadequacy, something that we don't feel good about ourselves in, and so we try and fill that with some of these activities, which oftentimes include the exploitation or the use of another person. Not beneficial for the community, only beneficial to feed your self-comfort, and probably doesn't do so effectively. We're in the realm of Greek philosophy a little bit with this, because that notion that anything of the body, pleasure, is unholy, comes from that Greek philosophy. The Stoics, who they figured if anything was divine, it was out of this world, so all things of this world must be unholy. And so they would abstain from the physical pleasures. And that is not what Jesus is implying here. He's not saying that emotion is bad or pleasure is bad. It's when you seek out selfish gain at the expense of others or your community, that is harmful. In our scriptures, there are generally three different types of love that are described using the words eros, philios, and agape. Now, eros and philios are, they're emotional. They are ways we feel about other people. The eros is the romantic love, when we find somebody that we're just head over heels about, and we have all these emotions of longing and connection that go with that. That's romance, and it's not something you can really choose. Like, I think I'm going to fall in love with so-and-so. It doesn't work that way. It just kind of happens. Philios is similar, but it's we have a common experience. We have a common ground to stand on, and we like the same things. It's that sort of brotherly love or familial love. And so we have something that holds us together, common ground, and that is the bond of philios. Once again, not something you can necessarily decide that you're going to love a person in that way. It just happens out of circumstance. But agape is not an emotional type of love. Agape is a decision to act in a loving way, to act in a way that supports those around you. So it may or may not be beneficial to you. Sometimes it's an act that will come with a bit of a cost to you. But in agape, you make the conscious decision to act in love, and there's no emotion in it. No emotion required in it. There may be emotion in it, but there's no emotion required for it. And you don't have to actually like somebody to love them in that way. But you make the conscious decision that you are going to give of yourself and move forward with actions that are lifting up the community, lifting up the other. And that is the difference in love that comes out of the teachings of Christ versus these other examples, which some people will call love, but really are detrimental to the welfare of others.